welcome everyone. We really appreciate you being here. We know that the end of a semester is, of course, the end of a semester, so we know what that means. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, and just kind of looking forward, if you like the lecture this afternoon, tomorrow he's giving also a morning seminar on Star Trek. We are not animals, so it's 10 a.m. We are not animals. And if you, on the poster it says that you were supposed to sign up until yesterday, but if you send me an email, I'll make these 2 episodes of Star Trek available to you, because that's what you need to do if you want to join the seminar. And it's going to be fun, as you'll see after or in a second. So that was a little advertisement for tomorrow, but before that, of course, it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest, Stefan, but on at least 2 continents, he's known as Steve. Stefan Rabitsch, who is a fixed-term assistant professor in American Studies, in the Department of American Studies, and a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Inter-American Studies at the University of Graz in, of course, Austria. He's a self-declared academic Trekkie. Trekkie is, of course, someone who watches Star Trek, just in case you didn't know. He's the author of and co-editor of 2 books devoted to Star Trek. Co-editor of a book, Fantastic Cities, American Urban Spaces, in science fiction, fantasy, and horror, that's coming out on University of Mississippi, University Press of Mississippi next year, and the co-editor of a forthcoming Routledge handbook to Star Trek. He's also a founding member of an editorial board of a journal of the Austrian Association for American Studies. And in general, his work, both teaching and research, focuses on, of course, American studies, on cultural history, science fiction, and, as you'll see today, on cowboy hats. His professorial, so that's the equivalent of our, well, it's not the equivalent, his habilitation dissertation that he's working on is precisely something that today's lecture is spinning off from. I wear a Stetson now. Stetsons are cool. It's the title, The Cultural History of Western Hats. And for that project, last year he was awarded a Fulbright Visiting Scholar grant in Texas, because, of course, no better place to research cowboy, or maybe they not be cowboys, Stetson or hats, Western hats. So this is me as far as the introduction is concerned, and let us welcome Steve Rabitsch.
Thank you. All righty. So, thank you, Pavel, for this most generous, indeed humbling introduction, and thank you for inviting me to the American Studies Center to share with you all some of the things I've been working on for a little while now. So that's the 2 gigs tomorrow, for those of you who still want to join those last minute. I'm really grateful that all of you made it out here, particularly since it's the end of the semester. I know what that feels like because my students back home feel the same way. And there's also a little bit of stuff that is more or less brand new, which I'm going to talk about in the next 45 minutes or so. You all have to know that Pavel and I first met almost 10 years ago. In July, actually, it will be 10 years at the annual conference of the Science Fiction Research Association in Scottsdale, Arizona. I was a freshly minted PhD candidate back then, overzealous, you might say, and totally into Mass Effect. So when I learned there was a pre-conference workshop on Mass Effect and transmedial storytelling, I showed up way too early, way before the room had even opened, way before the workshop leader, this man, was actually there. If you had told me right then and there that today would happen, I would have probably had a hard time believing that, even though I'm very much used to all sorts of weird and wonderful futures coming out of science fiction. So thank you once again, Pavel, for having me and for the years of collaboration and friendship, and I hope we can continue those in the future. I would also like to thank the American Studies Center at large to have me here. I would like to thank the chair of the American Studies Center, and I'm probably going to butcher the name nonetheless, Gregory Koch. I think that's you, right? Thank you for having me here. And I would also like to give a shout out to Magdalena, who designed this wonderful poster that's been all over this place. And last but certainly not least, a shout out to Fulbright Poland, since, as you just heard, my postdoctoral project was awarded a Fulbright grant last year. So let's get started at the proverbial sort of beginning, and I would like you all to get into this hat state of mind. And I would like to commence by sharing with you a super short video clip, believe it or not, which served as the initial impetus for my project. And that actually happened way before I had finished my PhD. So this one is taken from episode 1 of the 6th series of Doctor Who. And I hope you can hear it, but even if you don't, it doesn't matter too much because I'm going to...
Hey, nice hat. I wear a Stetson now. Stetsons are cool.
What you see in here is the Doctor brandishing his newly acquired hat gear, not the fez he's usually known for, telling his companions, quote, "I wear a Stetson now. Stetsons are cool." So that kind of gave me the working title of my project. So when I saw this first time, I scribbled it down on a note, and then toward the end of my PhD, there came this one day where I was looking for something that didn't have anything to do with my dissertation, so I just needed a little bit of a break and something else to read. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be great to learn a little bit more about cowboy hats? So you got to know that I've been wearing high-crowned, broad-brimmed Western-style hats ever since returning from a stint in Australia. And I couldn't, when I was looking for this cultural history, what I was actually looking for was a cultural history of Western hats. I couldn't find anything, so I scribbled that down on another sticky note. Fast forward a couple of years to today. By now I know there is no such thing as a cultural history of Western hats. And as the saying goes in academia, if you can't find it, you have to write it yourself. So that's what I'm currently working on. Of course, Stetson is but a brand of piece of clothing, often used synonymously with the object itself, which, while coming in many different forms, shapes, and sizes, speaks to a quintessential shape that makes it quite unique and, as I argue, instantly recognizable the world over. Western hats have a long and varied history, ranging from their transcultural origins as a practical everyday item, representing, among other things, also the American entrepreneurial spirit, to their global dissemination as an icon of American culture. So at this point, I'd like to share with you 3 perhaps polemic, but definitely simple yet pertinent observations that I would like you to keep in mind for the rest of this talk, because I'm going to return to them toward the end. First, Western and Western-style hats have always been worn by everybody, regardless of race, class, creed, gender, or age. Second, since a hat usually goes where its wearer goes, it's a material object that challenges all sorts of different kind of borders, geographic, regional, national, social. And third, I would like to quote Peter Tammany, who authored a short article back in the 1960s. It's an etymological piece trying to trace the origins of 2 expressions related to hats, the 10-gallon hat, the famous 10-gallon hat, and the Texas hat. And he put forth, quote, "One of the apt and incontrovertible definitions of a human being is one who wears a hat." So just think about that. And I'm being deliberately polemic here. Unless you miss a limb or something, wearing a hat is a very visible and obvious marker of identity. So before we head down into the rabbit hole where only mad hatters dare to venture, and all the hatters I met were anything but mad, trust me, I'd like to back up ever so briefly and speak to why hats matter in general. Like with so many other everyday items, we usually take them for granted. We don't really pay them much mind. On top of that, we also live in a relatively hatless age, with the exception of baseball caps, of course, and trucker hats, perhaps, and hoods. But hats do matter. For instance, I could have gone with Pharrell Williams's Mountain of a Cranial Cover. Looks very much like Arby's hats. That he wore that at the 2014 Grammy Awards, and it said "Social Media Ablaze." And this example would have also been very much in line with the title for my talk today, #I like big hats. But I figured I'd show you how and why hats matter by way of a little call and response experiment involving a piece of hat gear, and I need to stress that is not the principal object of my project. Nevertheless, it's an easy entry point to talk about hats, I would say. And I actually brought it with me. And yes, this is the real thing. And I've been trying to get off 45th's mailing list ever since I ordered this back in 2017. So here's why I need your help. Seeing the MAGA hat, what kind of associations do you have? What kind of meanings do you ascribe to this hat? Or alternatively, what kind of meanings does this hat emanate? And I'm more than happy to pass it around if you ever want to. No one wants to touch it? No one wants to touch it? Seriously? I'm not going to wear it. You're not going to see me wear it. But what kind of meanings do you associate with this hat? Anything?
Conservative right.
The conservative right, or the alt-right even, potentially? Okay. Anything else that immediately comes to mind, perhaps? Don't be shy. Nope.
I think we should start from Donald Trump. This is the first thing that comes to my mind.
Okay. So Donald Trump, obviously. Yeah. Thanks to an American friend of mine who's also a Fulbrighter here in Poland, up in Gdansk, I know that the MAGA hat also apparently left some echoes here in Poland. I'll tell you what I think about this hat, or by way of a couple of examples, perhaps. During one of his visits to the White House, Kanye West made a bunch of incoherent remarks not too long ago. I mean, that all by itself is not necessarily all that surprising, perhaps. But among those remarks, he pointed to something significant. He touted his MAGA hat and proclaimed that this hat gives him power. It's essentially his superhero costume. And yes, we might brush this aside as trivial and nonsensical, but Kanye spoke to something tangible, and that is the MAGA hat is, a wearable and thus nomadic totemic item of a certain version of Americanus. Now, while referring primarily to the U.S. Constitution, Max Lerner famously stated that, quote, every tribe needs its totem and its fetish, unquote. And these totems do ideological identity work. And the MAGA hat does just that for the tribe of Trump. So here's a trick question for you to give you an idea as to where I come from a theoretical and methodological point of view. Would you agree when I say that this hat has power? Remember, it's a trick question. Do you think this hat has power?
In itself, no.
Bingo. No, it doesn't. You're absolutely right. Of course, the MAGA hat doesn't have any power. It's given power because meaning is ascribed to it, primarily by those who use it and the things they use it for. With that, I'm aligning myself with a broader cultural studies and cultural history approach to material objects rather than a strict material culture studies approach. The latter is often charged with endless descriptions of stuff, and which tend to be accompanied by the claim that addressing questions of meaning is somewhat superficial, perhaps. So material culture studies then kind of tries to tap into some sort of like inherent essence of objects. That is, objects have some sort of like meaning in their own right, which I don't necessarily, I actually totally agree with you there. So drawing heavily on Bruno Latour's actor network theory, John Story reminds us, without denying objects their ontological physicality, because they're real, ontologically real, of course, intangible, that objects are by definition, quote, mute. The material objects that surround us do not issue their own meanings. They have to be made to mean, of course, and how they're made to signify informs how we feel about them, how we talk about them, what we think about them, etc. Story calls this, quote, the entanglement of signification and materiality enabled by social practice. But the meanings that organize and regulate social practice do not come from the materiality of things themselves. So they might be contingent on, enabled, or limited by an object's materiality, but the meanings come, of course, from those who have the power to make things mean in particular ways. So entanglement is structured by relations of power, so that gets us into discourses of privilege and power, which stratify who's access to certain materials, and so on and so forth. And I want to give you a few Western hatful of examples. So yes, I'm sticking with the current administration. In early summer 2017, the current administration proclaimed and celebrated its first Made in America week. They welcomed manufacturers from all over the country to showcase products that are made solely in America using only American labor, and thus representing America in its arguably purest form. Chief among the exhibitors was the Stetson Company, which used the occasion to present the president with an El Presidente 100X hat, which is a sort of tradition that supposedly goes all the way back to President Harry Truman. At the 2018 Made in America Week, the Saratelli Hat Company out of New Jersey showcased wearable Americanus. And at last year's Red, White, and Blue extravaganza, the hat was passed on to the Jackson Hole Hat Company out of Wyoming. A little aside this point, while I was visiting with Hatco in Garland, Texas, and the American Hat Company out of Bowie, Texas, in the spring of last year, the CEO of American Hat Company told me the following, which the VP of Hatco then confirmed. It's not that the administration actually goes out and tries to select companies and their products from each state to showcase at those events. You actually have to pay for the privilege. So if you're willing to cough up enough money, you're put in a pool of contenders. And for instance, the guys at American Hat Company told me that they, so far at least, they didn't want to do that. However, American Hat Company was contacted by Donald Trump Jr., who, after his father got elected, ordered a custom-made hat from them. But you can see there's always been at least one Western hat manufacturer at these showcases. And of course, this makes sense, because while they definitely play in a very different economic league than other exhibitors, such as Lockheed Martin, for instance. Last year, Lockheed Martin brought a mobile THAAD missile platform to the South Lawn. Western hats are still, as I would argue, in that top tier of pantheon of symbols, or in learners' terms, totems, that encapsulate Americanness. So it's really one of those icons, if you will. Sticking with the administration for one more example, and then we're done with Donald Trump for now. Because I've just come across that 2 weeks ago, we can also use Steve Miller, for example. He's, unless you're familiar with this guy, he's the chief architect of the president's anti-immigration platform, a great son of Jewish immigrants. He graduated from Santa Monica High School in LA County. Now, for his yearbook entry, as you can see here, he posed in a big black cowboy hat, quoting Teddy Roosevelt, who said, he used this particular quote, "There's room here for only 100% Americanism, only for those who are Americans and nothing else." So clear nativist language there. Miller, of course, was not the first aspiring politician to use the cowboy hat as a symbol of power and exclusion. In fact, the cowboy hat has become a persistent symbol for people who try to signify who is a real American and who's not. And yes, that's definitely accurate, and we'll get into that. But it's also a bit more complex than that. So remember, again, those three observations I gave you at the beginning. But of course, Western hats signify Americanness, and that's also tied to the basic premise of my project overall. Go anywhere in the world wearing a hat that is roughly shaped like mine, even though mine's an Australian bush hat and thus not a cowboy hat per se. 9 times out of 10, people will equate the hat with the United States, and more often than not also with the state of Texas. So we're talking about enormous symbolic power. So with my project, I try to fill a glaring gap in American cultural studies and cultural history, and especially Western studies, by way of what might be considered a fairly localized or regionalized subject area, particularly with the United States. So Western studies is usually kind of considered regional studies, to enhance that with a transnational appreciation and understanding. If encountered in academic sources at all, you'll find people who've looked at the Western as a genre, particularly as a film genre. They commented on cowboy hats every now and then because, of course, it's part of the genre's iconography. Even in comprehensive reference works dedicated to American fashion history, such as the multi-volume Greenwood Clothing Through American History series, or leading journals such as Dress or Fashion Theory, Western hats are afforded only cursory glances. Usually they're just bunched together with the Westering experience, the pioneering experience, and excluding a lot of other key dimensions when it comes to this particular piece of headgear. So how do I propose to talk about or conceptualize Western hats? I engage in what I have termed so far at least as hatology, so the study of hats. And I've been circling around this one working definition for Western hats as a species I labeled Petasus Americanus. So Petasus, every once in a while, your Latin comes in handy. Petasus is Latin for a particular style of traveler's hat worn by ancient Greeks, Macedonians, and Etruscans. And they were usually made out of felt, leather, or straw, and had a broad brim to protect people from the sun primarily, but from the elements in general. So I define the Western hat, or Petasus Americanus, as a significant, signifying wearable and thus nomadic cultural shape. So here I'm in part indebted to Deleuze and Guattari, but also cultural studies giant Stuart Hall and his circuit of culture model. And of course I'm tapping into this inherently interdisciplinary field of fashion studies, which was born out of the material turn and has been part of cultural studies at large, more or less since the late 1990s. So the study of fashion, or rather dress, which has increasingly become more widely accepted as a theoretical term, straddles the discourses of ethnicity, gender, class, as well as system of semiotics that, according to Grant McCracken, conceptualizes dress, quote, as a system of historically mobile meanings. So once again, there's a neat link to Deleuze and Guattari. Next to the object of dress itself, so that's just one part of the equation, the study of any piece of clothing also has to take the bodies of the wearer or wearers into consideration, and the various contexts that are culturally circumscribed, practices, performances, all of that is also part of the package. So drawing on this toolbox, my project builds on a synoptic toolbox or framework conceptualized by way of how we encounter the materiality of hats. So Western hats engage most human senses. First and foremost, they're readily recognized, identified, and seen as a distinctive shape. They usually have a wide brim, a high crown. They may be decorated with headbands and various small accessories. A host of creases bearing one or more distinctive names add individual character to the crown, and the same then also applies to the brim. Taken together, these features serve in part to identify the wearer with a particular professional community, or at least that used to be the case in the past. And the things that you can see up here, the shapes and cuts, are the most common shapes and cuts that you find today. Of course, these have changed over time, and there's regional differences, and each comes with a hatful of meanings. Among other things, this is why I had to visit with Western hat makers on site, large and small, to learn about the language, the tools of the trade, and also the workings of the trade. While available in virtually any color by now, Western hats tend to come in shades of beige, olive, khaki, brown, and black. Second, the materials used to manufacture Western hats can be felt. They're primarily made of felt or straw. They provide both insulation as well as protection, as in shade in diverse environments. Last but not least, upon very close encounter, it becomes apparent that hats are also odorous. And their smell ties them intimately to the body of the wearer and the various practical contexts they are worn, along with the set of regulatory rules that constitute what hat makers call etiquette. Even a casual search in Google, for instance, will lead you to a host of different pointers and explanations and guidelines as to when it's okay to wear a hat, where it's not okay to wear a hat. For instance, there's the universal don't touch anybody's hat without their permission, or the tricky issue of wearing hats indoors. It's perfectly okay to wear it to a bar or restaurants in certain regions of the United States, but then again, not in others. And then there is also the somewhat tenuous and highly gendered rule that any hat rules that apply to men do not apply to women, which is often you often hear people then use folksy expressions such as, cowgirls can get away with pretty much anything. So like I already said, I lean heavily on Stuart Hall's circuit of culture and weave it together with this four-tiered toolbox that I've extracted from fashion studies, which basically boils down to four vectors, if you will, to talk about fashion. That is object, culture, practice, and production. And these four vectors I use basically as a main scaffold and then basically tell a chronological or I use a chronological trajectory that serves to both acknowledge or first of all locate the origins of Western hats and then their global dissemination. So let me quickly go through those 4 dimensions along with a few more examples, only to make them a little bit fuzzier again for the final part of my talk, and where I really talk very basic American 101 study terms. Starting with the material object itself, I examine the production history of Western hats. This includes, but is not limited to, developing an intimate knowledge of fabric types, fabric processing techniques, for instance, craftsmanship and production technology. This dimension, for instance, also entails delineating Spanish and Mexican precursors, particularly vaquero and charro dress is very important, and I'll have a few more examples later on. The materiality of Western hats can only be accessed and thus mapped on site, so that's why I spent a lot of time in museum, storage facilities, archives, and of course in hatters' workshops. For instance, I spent a week down in the vaults at the National Cowboy Museum in Oklahoma City, or also right now I'm actually in the process of applying for a fellowship at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. You might say, to do some follow-up research, you might say, Delaware? Why Delaware? You have to know that the mid-Atlantic states, like Delaware, New Jersey, but also Pennsylvania, historically speaking, they were the central node for the textile and clothing industries in the United States, including hat makers, including famous brands such as Stetson. Focusing on the cultural dimension of hats essentially means talking about or tackling the representation of Western hats in different media and art forms. These hats have been inextricably tied to this mythical cowboy image, of course, that we're all familiar with. As such, they're also a key component to this national identity-defining mythos of the conquest of the West. So a multitude of meanings have been ascribed to Western hats. Some are pretty formulaic and simple, such as heroes wearing white hats and villains black hats back in the days of the B-movie Westerns. As such, they're also part and parcel of this nostalgia complex of the genre Western. Consequently, they bear, just think back to Stephen Miller for a second, his yearbook photo. They bear this imprint of jingoistic and misogynistic articulations of often toxic white masculinity, which non-normative images in popular culture have been increasingly calling into question, and I've brought you a few examples of that. Or, for example, take this interesting example I've found while working at the Haley Memorial Library in Midland, Texas. This is drawn from one of the promotional booklets that hat manufacturers like Stetson put into circulation in the early 19-teens and 1920s, like the Stetson Hat in Literature. In one of those booklets, the Stetson hat was described as, quote, a sombrero with a college education. So again, tells you quite a bit. As Westerns were and still are a staple in America's soft cultural imperialism, the image as well as the object of the Western hat can be found on many foreign shores. For example, sizable communities in Germany and Japan have developed a particular affinity for the mythos of the American West. The president of South Sudan, Salva Kiir, he with former President Barack Obama, always wears a Stetson, which was given to him by President George W. Bush during a state visit in 2006. And there's even a little bit of a hatological echo in Poland, I recently learned, thanks to a wonderful article by Agnieszka Graf, titled Claiming the Shipyard, the Cowboy Hat, and the Anchor for Women. Polish Feminism's Dialogue and Struggle with National Symbolism. And she provides a great dissection and contextualization of what I gather is a fairly well-known poster around these parts, Carrie Cooper here. And while the shape of Western hats has, of course, made its way and also into non-genre art forms, I argue that Western hats, just like the Western, can never fully escape the latent imprint of America's imperial, homegrown imperial narrative of conquering the West. So in this context, my main goal is basically identifying those historical nodes that made this compression of meaning and the global dissemination of the hats possible. Practice-based approach is closely intertwined with cultural representations of dress, and that it enables the appraisal of the social life of clothing, Going beyond the materiality of the object as well as the initial production and purchase, Western hats have always been part of situated bodily practices. Whether it's, of course, an essential protective item in actual ranch life, and people still wear them, a largely ornamental item in cultural traditions growing out of ranching, think rodeos, or an ideologically charged symbol for political practices, Western hats are always a part of body-based performance. As for the latter, think of American cowboy diplomacy, which is primarily associated with a number of U.S. presidents who touted their Western hats on purpose and with panache, people like Lyndon Baines Johnson, Ronald Reagan, and George W. Bush. Cultural diplomacy is an extension of actual foreign policy. And a pretty obvious example would be the Olympics, for instance, where Western hats were part of the official attire of Team USA more than once over the decades, both during the Cold War as well as after. For instance, the outfit for the Games in Tokyo in 1964 make for an interesting example because the men in the team were outfitted with the open road model of the Stetson, and that was also the hat that Lyndon Baines Johnson wore on a regular basis. So practice inevitably also intersects with questions of ethnicity, gender, and class, and I've got a few surprising images perhaps in a moment. Last but not least, as a material object, any fashion item is informed by its production, ultimately also its consumption. Yunya Kawamura has delineated fashionology as a concept to study the production of clothing as this network of institutions and their economic practices. They include but are not limited to textile companies, retailers, designers, fashion magazines, the modeling and advertising industry, and first and foremost, of course, the manufacturing companies themselves. Again, think flows of capital and movement of material and resources. For instance, just off the top of my head, one thing that I learned while visiting with the two big hat makers in Texas, the corporate outfits, was that most of their rabbit fur, in particular, comes out of Europe, actually, Portugal and Belgium in particular. So there's this global dimension to it as well. For example, trade and mail order catalogs are one of the best sources to trace the development and history of hats, hat styles, how they changed over time. And while I was on my Fulbright grant, I started to collect and scan as many of those as I could find. There's, of course, big ones that you might have heard about, like Sears and Roebuck or Montgomery Ward, but also a ton of smaller ones that catered specifically to the ranching communities in the Western United States, whether it's a catalog like Hamley's Cowboy catalog, they were based in, or they're no longer in business, they were based in Pendleton, Oregon, for instance. I'm painting in very broad strokes here, but if you're looking for any kind of regularity, perhaps, or conformity, or even industry norms, in the hat making trade, you will be sorely disappointed. So there's basically a few larger regional styles you can talk about. Other than that, it gets a bit hairy. So that's one of the things I'm currently also struggling with a little bit. But let's back up a little bit. As I intimated at the beginning, the history of Western hats and thus their meanings are as complex as the country itself. So what I've just tried to sketch out for you in some sort of semblance of a structure are basically the dominant clusters of meanings that are ascribed to this species of hat. John Story reminds us that how a material object is made meaningful is both enabled and constrained by its materiality. So, as I said before, I don't necessarily want to fall into the pitfalls of strict material culture studies by attributing any sort of inherent meaning or quality to Western hats, but the materials they're mostly made out of, so fur, felt, and straw, lend themselves as analogies to develop a more complex and nuanced understanding of Western hats as, perhaps as Latour would describe it, as agents in the actor network theory. Now, this points us back to the three basic observations I gave you at the beginning, like Western hats making borders and boundaries problematic on account of them going where their wearer goes. We can employ Western hats as a sort of fulcrum to point it at questions, really basic questions that we constantly come back to, particularly also when we talk about basic American culture studies, how we define American culture at large, the cultural fabric of the American West in particular. and actually articulate those questions through the hat's materiality. And that's just something where I use you as a bit of as a lab. Quite frankly, I'm just testing a few things. And we can do that thinking America through hats, if you will, through this particular kind of hat, along two ways. So Western hats as a shape and the raw material they're made out of. And what I'm asking you to do with me now is look at American culture at large through Western hats at different levels of magnification. Level one, Western hats are a deceivingly simple and instantly recognizable shape, like we already talked about. Everyone can conjure up a mental image of its generic properties, characteristics. So they usually have this broader brim, which bears certain curved crease, and a relatively high crown, which usually also has a crease. So we've already established that they usually come in colors like black, brown, white, and what hatters call silver belly, which is a type of gray. So this gives us basically a generic approximation of what is seemingly a singular materiality. So a rather homogenized image of Western hats, which, moving on to, of course, obscures the great variety hidden by this generic image of the cowboy hat. Western hats have, of course, always come in many different shapes and sizes, and while the color palette was initially a bit more limited, by now you can find them in virtually any color, from bright pink to you name it. We can find a correlative to these two levels of magnification when we look at the properties of the raw materials those hats are made of and their production process. And for the time being, I'm just going to stick to felt. Fur felt, not least because it's winter, and winter is felt season. So felt is a fascinating material. That's one of the greatest revelations, actually, I learned for myself while I was in Texas. Felt is, I'd never really paid much attention to felt, but felt is one of the oldest materials known to humanity. It's the smoothest, strongest, and lightest non-woven fabric. Felt is used to make Western hats. The felt that is used is the downy underfur of certain animals, chiefly hare and rabbit for cheaper hats. And then, of course, you've got beaver. And for the top line of the hats, nowadays, they also mix chinchilla into their fur mix. So there are these tiny barbs on the tips of the fur fibers, which start interlocking with each other in every direction as soon as those fur fibers are mixed together for the first time. And then in successive stages, they're repeatedly put into hot water and pounded, which makes those barbs interlock even tighter, and then those raw hat bodies start to shrink. It's a fascinating process, and I've seen the entire thing in two different hat makers, and it takes about like 25 steps to make that happen. In more than those 25 steps, the hat bodies are then blocked and flanged. A combination of steam and pressure is used in the process, and then they're also repeatedly sanded or pounced, as hat makers would say, until you have this incredibly smooth surface. And some hatters swear by the application of shark skin to put the final touches on a felt hat. So you have this very, or seemingly uniform material at the end of it. But of course, if you zoom in to the microscopical level again, you see those teeny tiny individual fibers interlocked. You might have already have a notion as to where I'm going to go with this. I think conceptualizing Western hats and the materiality like this lends itself to reappraise American exceptionalism homogeneity as well as American multiculturalism through a fresh analogical lens. So this is where you just become my guinea pigs, if you will. And guinea pigs are not being harmed in the production of hats. I just want to stress that. So in textbook terms, I was just thinking, I couldn't help but think, I would argue and conflate the generic shape of Petasus Americanus, so this image, the general image that we have when we think cowboy hats, the archetype, if you will, so the smoothness and uniformity of the finished fur, with the concept of America as the supposed melting pot, if you will. And since we're talking about cowboy hats, there's a Turnerian inflection to that, as in Frederick Jackson Turner, I'll get to in the next slide. Conversely, I would align the wide variety, of course, with Western hats that's always been there, and the fiber materiality of felt with the concept of America as this multicultural salad bowl or whatever other analogy you want to use, stuff that you find in American Studies 101 textbooks. And that's essentially my working definition of Western hats broken down into American Studies 101 terms. I have a specific hat-related example to illustrate what I just outlined in more abstract terms, because as soon as we no longer take the privileged or dominant meanings of objects, which are often narrativized, so we're often also looking at very powerful stories, as soon as we no longer take those for granted, the legitimacy of their power is threatened, and borders first become visible, and then also usually contested. And all you have to do is look at the origin histories of the cowboy hat. The popular story usually goes as follows. Prior to the Civil War, there were no cowboy hats. Along comes John Betterson Stetson and invents the cowboy hat, and the rest is history, like they say. So I want to flesh this out ever so briefly. In pursuit of his own frontier rejuvenation, he actually went out west recovering from a bout of tuberculosis, then started mining for gold in Colorado. Stetson had learned the hat-making trade from his father, and while out in Colorado, he turned this skill into, and also recognized there was a market, there was a need for warm, water-repellent clothing. He used his skill and started to make and sell felt blankets and felt hats. Returning to the East Coast, a prospector turned entrepreneur, he took out a modest loan and transformed a small hat business into an industrial behemoth so that by 1900, he actually owned the largest hat factory in the world. In 1889, the Stetson won Best Hat at the Exposition Universelle in Paris, so the World's Fair in Paris, bringing what was considered a uniquely American style to the attention of the world. And how did he do that? He relied, for instance, on celebrities to promote, who were engaged in the promotion of the Western mythos anyway, to also promote his products. Celebrities such as Buffalo Bill, Annie Oakley, Calamity Jane, or Will Rogers. Since then, the name Stetson is still often synonymously used with the material object, even though, of course, there are plenty of other hat makers and manufacturers. So Stetson in this case is just like Xerox or Kleenex, for instance. And, of course, the Stetson story is deeply enmeshed in powerful American narratives, such as the Horatio Alger, Rex Torricius mythos, and, of course, the Turner's Frontier Paradigm as well. And these narratives are still very much employed by the hat-making folks at Hatco, because Hatco now is the company that produces Stetson hats. Now, since I gave you that story, there's, of course, another story, because the origin of Western hats is indeed fuzzier and more complex, and that this quintessential American shape is the product of intercultural and material exchanges in overlapping zones of contact, and its subsequent dispersal across the western United States, where again it underwent regional adaptation. So Western hats did not really come out of nowhere after the Civil War. Rather, they were the product of decades of Anglo-Latina and also a little bit of French cultural practices rubbing against each other in what is now central and southwest Texas. It's well documented that the lion's share of Anglo ranching culture and ranching horsemanship derived from vaquero know-how and heritage, and translated into cranial covers, we can map the origin of the cowboy hat as a coming together of and mixing of different styles derived from different cultural communities, material flows, and economic agendas. So it was in that border region where the poblano and the sombrero met with the planter's hat and the gambler's hat and the slouch hats that particularly Southerners brought with them down south. Since these styles were made for practical, necessary, protective headgear, the cowboys who worked on the large cattle drives, driving cattle out of Texas up into Kansas and further, they took those hats with them. And as you can see, by virtue of those hats essentially not knowing any boundaries, they make difficult borders and their attendant power structures. And at the same time, of course, Western hats belong to the repertoire of the Anglo-cowboy myth, the white Anglo-cowboy myth, which is one of those common places where unadulterated white male American exceptionalism still holds out. Now, to round things off, I would like to share with you a sort of eclectic mix of instances that showcase where and how Western hats can be used to problematize the privileged cowboy mythos and thus engage in some critical whiteness studies. And you all better hold fast because I'm going to take a sharp left turn right now. and turn to the creative labor of African American artists, I'm going to talk about the Yehaw Agenda. How many of you have ever heard about the Yehaw Agenda? Anyone ever heard that term? No? Okay, it's fairly recent. The term was coined in September 2018 by Brie Melandro, giving name to the creative forces in the African-American art scene that had been percolating for a little while and kind of spiked late in 2018 and continuing throughout 2019. Melandro retweeted a Chiara photo shoot where Chiara wears a cowboy hat in each and every picture. And as a response, Melandro wrote, quote, "The Yehaw Agenda is in full effect." Melandro spoke to a resurgence of country western style elements that was fully underway in 2018, with, for instance, fashion label Para Moss featuring the urban-based black horseback riding organization the Compton Cowboys, movie forthcoming with Idris Elba, I think, starring, among others, and the Cowgirls of Color rodeo team. Then, early last year in 2019, Cardi B opened the Houston Rodeo with a record-breaking performance eclipsing the attendance record set by Garth Brooks. She sported a flamboyant Western outfit and paid homage to Selena, a Tejano singer-artist who inspired the rapper's garb. Then, of course, came Lil Nas X, and I think that name does sound familiar. Lil Nas X with Old Town Road, inflaming debates over what is country music vis-a-vis the troubled history of painting over the many ongoing contributions that black musicians have made to the genre. The Yehaw Agenda is all about seizing and democratizing Western ephemera in an effort to reclaim and make more visible the long-standing African-American heritage. Western hats are the most potent of cowboy accoutrements, I would argue, more powerful than a six-shooter, because the hat is the cowboy's crown, which, as the saying goes, is the first thing they put on in the morning and the last thing they take off at night before tucking in. So those artists that fuel the Yehaw Agenda use them to point to those who have been kept on the outside, on the margins of the privileged white boundaries of cowboydom. Let's not forget, historically, anywhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of cowboys on the range were actually black. They made important contributions to ranching and horsemanship. Just take Bill Pickett, for instance. He actually invented the technique of bulldogging, where you wrestle down a young steer in the late 19th century. And that technique of bulldogging has since become a staple on the rodeo circuit. It's one of the main disciplines in rodeo. There's a rich tradition of African-American trail riding associations and rodeos, like, for instance, the Bill Pickett Invitational Rodeo, which was recently documented by the photographer Gabriella Hasburn. And there's also, of course, the famed Buffalo Soldiers that you might be familiar with. And each of these instances where we see a non-white person wearing a cowboy hat, engaging in a social practice that has been primarily associated with white Anglo ranching culture and horsemanship, points to the latter's borders and then also makes them fuzzy. Of course, there are plenty more examples, like the equally important and underrepresented contributions of Native American cowboys, who adopted a key symbol of the oppressor in an attempt to wear the empire back, if you will. Peter Iverson is a great source on that. Like with African-American cowboys, Native Americans have a rich history in cowboydom. They've also had an impact on the world of rodeo, continue to have an impact on the rodeo circuit as well, perhaps beginning with Jackson Sundown, whose Nez Perce name was Blanket of the Sun. He was actually the nephew of a very famous Native American leader, the Nez Perce leader, Chief Joseph, who you might have heard about already. Sundown was a fierce bronc rider who was essentially cheated out of the World Championship in 1911 and 1915, respectively. As it's become pretty clear, the mythos of the West is irrevocably entangled with white privilege, which, however, I'd argue can easily be fractured by looking at Western hats. The same is true for cowboy hats as purveyors of a heteronormative, often deeply toxic masculinity. Of course, non-normative images in popular culture have increasingly called this into question. Just think of a movie like Brokeback Mountain, but I also want to stress that movies and short stories like Brokeback are really just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. For instance, one thing I can wholeheartedly recommend, based on personal experience, if you ever get a chance to travel out west, go and seek out a rodeo by the IGRA, the International Gay Rodeo Association. They've been going strong since the 1980s. I mentioned Lil Nas X earlier. We can also look to singer-songwriter Orville Peck. Anyone ever heard of Orville Peck by any chance? Yes? He also offers a rebellious, glamorous take on icons such as the Lone Ranger. He always appears in a frilled mask, has this sort of crooning style, singing about things like gay hustlers in Nevada or acts of homophobic hate and the toll that those acts take on victims, all the while wearing Petasus Americanus. And I contend that these interpretations of such a potent symbol of Americanus says a lot more about American identity than the likes of Stephen Miller, for instance, ever could. And that's more or less what I'm going to leave you with. That is, Western hats matter. Their cultural history isn't only as complex as the materials they're usually made of, but also as complex as the history of the culture or the country they're usually conflated with. And it doesn't take too much critical effort to lift the brim that shades commonly held associations, which undoubtedly still exerts significant power, of course, but see that other bodies have always worn such hats too. For every Cordell Walker, there's a Bass Reeves. If you've never heard of Bass Reeves, please Google him. There's also now a brand new movie that's just come out. For every rugged cattle-driving cowboy on the silver screen, there is an Annie Oakley. There is an Elizabeth Collins, for instance, the cattle queen of Montana. And the world of rodeo does not begin or end with the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association, the PCRA, either. While they may appear to be merely a simple piece of practical clothing imbued with a set of very unambiguous and privileged American meanings, Western hats are actually entangled with material, historical, and cultural complexities which make the American West, and I contend America at large, more difficult. And I think that is a good thing. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm more than happy to try and answer any of your questions. Thank you.